From CSR to ESG to BHR, how the corporate social responsibility movement has shifted from risk abatement to risk management to risk exposure. By Jim Kelly, June 7, 2012. First, let me express my thanks to Jim Roberts and the Heritage Foundation for inviting me to participate in this panel discussion. As the Federal Society does not take positions on matters of public policy, I'm speaking today as president of Solidarity Center for Law and Justice, a public interest civil and human rights law firm that promotes human rights in a manner that respects national sovereignty, individual and economic liberty, the democratic process, and the rule of law. Jim, Professor Markley and you have done a great service in publishing your Heritage Backgrounder on why the U.S. should oppose international corporate social responsibility mandates. It has added a degree of balance to a movement that has been controlled by activists who view transnational businesses as the next source of the unsustainable social welfare spending in which governments can no longer engage. Introduction. In my remarks, consistent with the shift in corporate social responsibility noted by Jim and Andy in their backgrounder, I will discuss now how, during the past 40 years, businesses have moved from concern for corporate social responsibility, or CSR, to concern for environmental, social, and governance issues, or ESG, to concern for business and human rights, or BHR. In essence, there has been a shift from risk abatement to risk management to risk exposure. In their Heritage Backgrounder, Jim and Andy concisely capture the three key features of the evolutionary shift that has taken place toward the new corporate social responsibility. 1. The movement from voluntary initiatives to mandated standards. 2. The move from targeted projects to comprehensive obligations. And 3. The movement from flexible communications to highly structured reporting. The Corporate Social Responsibility Agenda. In its initial form, corporate social responsibility evidenced the goal of socially responsible corporations to operate in a manner that would protect society from environmental disasters or massive personal injuries arising from grossly negligent or willful and wanton business practices. Things such as oil spills, air pollution, deforestation, and patently unsafe products come to mind. In the late 1970s, corporations realized that they had a responsibility to avoid these activities and voluntarily engage in targeted remedial CSR programs, the details of which they communicated to the public and the media. During the 1980s, as corporations increased their activities in developing countries, activists regarded transnational businesses as being responsible for the disproportionate consumption of natural resources, environmental degradation, the depletion of biological diversity, and harmful water and land use policies. In response, many large companies signed on to a new Sustainable Development Agenda. They embraced the conclusions of the World Commission on Environment and Development, as contained in its 1987 Brundtland report titled Our Common Future. In 1991, the International Chamber of Commerce published its Business Charter for Sustainable Development, to which many of its corporate members subscribe. Global business leaders actively participated in the 1992 UN Conference on Environment and Development held in Rio de Janeiro. As part of that process, the newly formed Business Council for Sustainable Development adopted a declaration that called on businesses to expand the concept of those who have a stake in their businesses, quote, to include not only employees and shareholders, but also suppliers, customers, neighbors, citizens groups, and others, end quote. the environmental, social, governance, or ESG agenda. During the 1990s, activists focused media and academic attention on anthropocentric global warming, a controversial and unproven environmental phenomenon. They began making the case for holding transnational businesses responsible for helping to mitigate the negative impacts of climate change on developing countries. They also called upon transnational businesses to accept responsibility for global problems beyond climate change, including perceived social injustices and corporate complicity with corrupt authoritarian regimes. As a result of these pressures, many global corporations embraced the new ESG movement, under which they were expected to voluntarily report on their efforts to prevent environmental, social, and governance abuses. By 2005, many transnational business leaders had signed on to one or more ESG initiatives, including the UN Global Compact, the OECD Guidelines on Multinational Enterprises, the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, and the Global Reporting Initiative Sustainability Reporting Framework. Thus, by 2005, CSR had morphed into ESG. The shift noted by Jim and Andy's backgrounder was well on its way. From voluntary principles to mandated standards, from targeted projects to comprehensive obligations, and from flexible communications to highly structured reporting. Over the next 7 years, the ESG movement produced a new generation of standards, obligations, and reporting. ESG consulting firms appeared, law firms added ESG departments, and international accounting firms launched work on an ESG integrated audit reporting process. Interestingly, ESG activists were not solely responsible for advancing these developments. In fact, 4 key business sectors played a role in promoting the ESG agenda: financial firms such as Barclays, pension fund investment firms such as PGGM and CalPERS, insurance firms such as Willis, and high-profile transnational companies such as Unilever. Obviously, financial firms, pension fund investment firms, and insurance firms have a significant financial stake in making sure that the companies in which they invest or which they insure are implementing the ESG agenda. In essence, they are engaging in risk management by reducing their exposure to losses resulting from the failure of other companies to adhere to the environmental, social, and governance demands of activists, politicians, lawyers, accountants, and international organizations. That leaves us to consider those transnational businesses that have willingly implemented the ESG norms into their business operations. As to why a global corporation would place the fate of its shareholders in the hands of the ESG activist community, I will let speak for themselves the words of Unilever CEO Paul Polman as expressed in a recent Harvard Business Review interview. When asked, "Is it really business's role to take on these issues?" CEO Polman responded, quote, "There are clear signs of stress around the world coming from the other 99%. 1 billion people still go to bed hungry. A child dies of starvation every 6 seconds. Our form of capitalism has brought us far, but it hasn't solved everything. We think that businesses that are responsible and actually make contributing to society a part of their business model will be successful," end quote. Well, there is at least one thing about, quote, "our form of capitalism," quote, with which Mr. Pullman agrees. In 2010, his total compensation was $2.87 million. The Business and Human Rights, or BHR agenda. Recently, we have entered into a third stage in the evolution of corporate social responsibility, which is the business and human rights agenda being pursued by the United Nations and its partner NGOs. Since 2000, human rights activists have viewed transnational businesses as a potential source for funding the global redistribution of wealth, from developed countries to developing countries. At the 2005 session of the Geneva-based UN Council on Human Rights, an attempt to adopt an international treaty that would have bound transnational businesses to human rights norms failed. To placate human rights activists, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan appointed John Ruggie as his special representative for business and human rights. The outcome of Mr. Ruggie's work is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which includes a framework calling upon governments to protect human rights, corporations to respect human rights, and both to help remedy human rights abuses. Though embraced by several key players in the CSR ESG movement, many human rights activists are disappointed that the UN Guiding Principles fall short of the mandatory human rights protections and enforcement mechanisms that would have been provided by an international treaty. These activists can take some solace in the fact that the head of the new UN Working Group on the issue of human rights and transnational corporations has publicly endorsed a proposed global tax on financial transactions. The tax would be used to create a fund administered by UN officials to compensate people for the negative impact of the global financial crisis. Does the phrase oil for food scandal ring a bell? One can imagine a variety of global taxes imposed on business transactions to fund the realization of economic rights in developing countries, including a tax on real estate sales to provide housing, a tax on carbon emissions to provide development assistance to those affected by climate change, a tax on business energy consumption to develop alternative energy sources, and a tax on tourism to provide education and job training to indigenous populations. But beyond the possible imposition of global taxes on business activities, two foundational elements of the UN Guiding Principles should concern corporate leaders. First, the UN Guiding Principles call for transnational businesses to conduct highly invasive human rights impact assessments. This assessment process requires them to examine the totality of their business planning and operations to determine the extent to which they are not adhering to the entire range of economic, social, and cultural rights. The UN, human rights activists, ESG consultants, and law firms are already applying pressure on transnational businesses to conduct human rights impact assessments and disclose the results. If they comply, global corporations will be empowering these groups to make unreasonable and expensive demands for systemic changes to the way they conduct their businesses and measure their success. A second foundational concern about the Business and Human Rights, or BHR, agenda contained in the UN Guiding Principles is that there is a matrix of human rights governance networks in place and prepared to hold corporations accountable for realizing economic and social rights in both developed and developing countries. In several countries, national human rights institutions and the representatives of UN human rights treaty body committees have begun partnering with local civil society organizations to pressure legislatures to impose business and human rights mandates on businesses. Those global business leaders who fall prey to the siren song of the BHR phase of corporate social responsibility will be harming free market capitalism and its proven ability to improve the economic outcomes of billions of people. Their focus on satisfying the economic and social rights agenda of UN bureaucrats and human rights activists has at least 10 negative effects. 1. It distracts corporations from their core business functions. 2. It dampens employee and shareholder enthusiasm for investing in companies that operate in developing countries. 3. It diverts attention away from civil and political rights that are critical to the development of healthy democratic societies. 4. It dictates the spending of a large amount of financial resources on preventing or eliminating economic and social imbalances that may not be attributable to corporate activities. 5. It drives policymakers, academics, nonprofit leaders, and the general public toward an unrealistic and counterproductive view of the purpose of business. 6. It deceives state and national politicians into thinking that businesses are responsible for replacing government spending on social welfare programs. 7. It develops into a body of soft law and eventually hard law norms that human rights activists will use to hold transnational businesses accountable in domestic and international courts. 8. It demands that small and medium-sized businesses comply with a complicated and costly human rights regulatory environment imposed on them by government, society, and the global corporations to whom many of them sell their products and services. 9. It delivers a competitive advantage to Chinese companies whose government officials will not hold them accountable for complying with the West's prescription for using human rights as a means for redistributing global wealth. And 10. It dilutes the sovereign right of democratic nations to determine the manner in which they wish to regulate the domestic and foreign activities of their corporate citizens. Simply put, the BHR phase of the CSR movement represents a fork in the road for transnational business leaders. On the one hand, they can either blindly travel down the BHR path, wrongly assuming that they will be able to finesse or manage the human rights impact assessments and compliance processes. Alternatively, they can take the sage advice of Jim Roberts and Andy Markley and oppose international corporate social responsibility mandates.